Setting the scene. A winter night in the medieval village. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. It's the middle of winter, sometime around the year 1300. Snow has been falling all day, and by night, the world outside is a blanket of white. The village paths are covered, the fields are frozen, and the little stream that once gurgled happily is now sealed under a sheet of ice. It's quiet out there, eerily quiet, except for the occasional howl of a wolf in the distance or the creak of trees weighed down by snow. Inside the village, though, things are less peaceful. A thin trail of smoke rises from the chimneys of a handful of timber-framed houses. Behind their crooked doors and drafty shutters, medieval peasants are doing their best to survive the coldest time of year. Remember, no heaters, no electric blankets, no hot chocolate, just a smoky fire, a pile of straw, and maybe a stubborn goat sharing the living space. Now, let's be clear, medieval winters weren't just a bit chilly. In Europe, especially during what's sometimes called the Little Ice Age, winters could be brutally cold. Crops failed, rivers froze, and entire villages sometimes starved. So when we talk about peasants surviving the winter, we really mean it. They had to be clever, tough, and just a little lucky. But survival didn't mean comfort. Forget fluffy duvets and cozy log cabins. A peasant's night in winter was more like, I hope this thin cloak, this questionable soup, and the warmth of 3 other people crammed into the bed will keep me alive until morning. Romantic, right? A typical winter evening as night falls, a peasant family gathers in their one-room home. And yes, most peasants had just one room. You'd cook, eat, work, sleep, and occasionally argue with your spouse all in the same space. Privacy. That was a luxury for the nobility. If you wanted privacy in a peasant's hut, your best bet was to step outside, which, in the middle of January, probably wasn't worth it. The family huddles around the fire. It's not a big roaring fireplace like you see in medieval movies. More often, it was a simple open hearth in the middle of the room, with smoke drifting upward through a hole in the roof. This meant the room was smoky most of the time. Your eyes would water, your throat would burn, and your clothes would smell like a campfire year-round. But hey, at least the smoke kept the bugs away. Silver linings. Dinner would have already been eaten by now, and dinner is maybe too generous a word. In winter, it was often just some bread, maybe a thin vegetable soup, or, if you were lucky, some preserved meat. If it was a hard winter, food supplies would already be running low. So forget about feasting, this was survival eating. After eating, there wasn't much else to do but settle down for the night. Remember, no electricity meant no lights. Once the sun went down, candles and oil lamps were precious and expensive. So when darkness fell, peasants usually just went to bed. In a way, winter nights were long stretches of forced rest if you weren't freezing too much to sleep. That is, the sounds of a medieval winter night now. Picture lying there in a straw bed. You're wrapped in a rough wool blanket. Around you, you can hear the sounds of the house settling into sleep. Your father snores loudly. Your mother mutters a prayer. Your little brother kicks you in his sleep. In the corner, a cow shifts on its hooves, chewing thoughtfully. Yes, a cow. Because in the dead of winter, it wasn't unusual to bring animals into the house. Not for fun, but because their body heat actually helped warm the room. Plus, you could keep an eye on them so they didn't freeze to death in the barn. Outside, it's not silent. Wolves sometimes prowled near villages in search of food. Wind rattled shutters and whistled through the cracks in the walls. And endless snow kept falling, sometimes piling up so high that it sealed doors shut. That's the kind of night we're talking about. No such thing as cozy now. Let's talk comfort. Spoiler, there wasn't much. Medieval homes weren't well insulated. Walls might be made of wattle and daub, that's basically woven sticks covered in mud. It worked okay in summer, but in winter, drafts blew straight through, roofs leaked, doors didn't fit right, and the floor was usually just dirt. If you've ever been camping in the cold with a cheap tent, you have a pretty good idea of what a medieval peasant house felt like in January. Except you're stuck in it 4 months, not just a weekend. Even the fire wasn't always reliable. Fuel, usually wood, or peat wasn't easy to come by. Cutting trees was often restricted by the local lord, and peasants had to make do with what they could gather. Sometimes that meant burning dried animal dung. Yes, that was a thing. And no, it didn't smell great. But when your choices are smelly heat or freezing to death, you stop being picky. The mental side of surviving winter wasn't just about keeping your body warm, it was about keeping your mind from giving up. Long nights, little food, and constant cold could wear you down. So peasants turned to faith, tradition, and community to get through it. Winter nights were often filled with prayers to saints, small rituals for protection, and storytelling. Imagine sitting around that smoky fire, listening to your grandmother spin tales about saints, spirits, or the strange creatures that supposedly lurked in the woods. It gave people hope, distraction, and maybe even a little entertainment. Of course, gossip also thrived in these long nights. Who had extra grain hidden away? Who wasn't pulling their weight in the village? Who was secretly meeting whose daughter by the mill? Winter gave people plenty of time to whisper. So, how did they really do it? At the end of the day, medieval peasants survived winter nights through a mix of grit, clever tricks, and sheer endurance. They wore layers of wool, shared body heat, kept fires going as best they could, and brought their animals inside for warmth. They ate whatever they had, prayed for the worst to pass, and clung to the hope of spring. And let's be honest, most of us today wouldn't last a week in those conditions. If our Wi-Fi goes down for an hour, we panic. Imagine dealing with no heat, no lights, and sleeping next to a goat 4 months on end. But for peasants, this was just life. Difficult, yes, but also normal. And somehow, year after year, they made it through the coldest nights, emerging every spring to start the cycle all over again. The peasant's home, drafty but practical. If you've ever complained about your apartment being too cold in winter, just remember at least your walls aren't made of sticks and mud. Medieval peasants weren't exactly spoiled for choice when it came to architecture. Their homes were simple, small, and, let's be honest, kind of drafty. But they were practical. And in a world where survival mattered more than style, practicality was all that counted. So, let's take a little tour of a typical medieval peasant house. Don't worry, you don't need to take your shoes off. The floor is dirt anyway. The basic blueprint: most peasants lived in what historians like to call crock houses or longhouses. That sounds fancier than it was. In reality, we're talking about a rectangular structure with wooden frames, filled in with a material called wattle and daub. That's basically woven sticks plastered over with mud, clay, and sometimes animal dung. Yes, boot was part of your wall. Good insulation? Not really. But hey, it was cheap and easy to build. The roof was usually thatched, which meant bundles of straw layered thickly to keep the rain and snow out. Thatch was surprisingly decent at insulation, as long as it stayed dry. But in heavy snow, roofs sometimes caved in. So a winter night might include not just shivering under a blanket, but also listening for the ominous creak of your ceiling threatening to dump half a ton of wet straw on your head. Sweet dreams. Windows, if you had them, were tiny. Often they weren't glass, but just holes covered with wooden shutters, cloth, or even animal skin. In winter, they stayed firmly shut to keep out the freezing wind. That meant houses were dim and smoky inside. But at least you weren't turning into a human icicle. One room fits all now. You might be picturing a cozy little cottage with separate rooms for sleeping, eating, and cooking. Forget it. For most peasants, the entire family lived, cooked, and slept in a single room. The half the open fire sat in the middle or along one wall, serving as both the kitchen and the heating system. Beds. If you were lucky, you had a wooden frame stuffed with straw. If not, you slept directly on the floor. Privacy. That was a luxury you didn't even dream of. Everyone from grandma down to the toddler shared the same space. And sometimes, so did your animals. Chickens clucked in the corner. A goat or pig might be tethered near the wall. And if you had a cow, it might even sleep inside during the coldest months. Not because peasants were overly attached to their cows, but because cows radiated warmth like big, mooing space heaters. So, In one room, you had people eating, babies crying, fire smoke filling the air, animals shuffling around, and maybe someone snoring like a medieval chainsaw. Was it comfortable? Not really. But it was survival. The smell factor, and let's talk about the smell for a moment, because it's easy to romanticize these houses in storybooks. The truth is, they didn't smell great. Between the animals, the smoky fire, unwashed clothes, and the fact that people weren't exactly showering every day, the aroma was intense. Add in the thatched roof, which sometimes became home to bugs, mice, or birds, and you've got a very authentic medieval perfume. But for peasants, this was just normal. When everyone smells equally bad, you stop noticing. Winter adjustments. So, what happened when winter came? Peasants did a few simple but effective things to make their homes slightly less miserable. First, they sealed up cracks with extra mud, straw, or even rags stuffed into gaps. Anything to stop the freezing drafts from sneaking in. Second, they spread rushes or straw on the floor to keep bare feet from freezing against the dirt. Think of it as a medieval carpet, cheap, replaceable, and occasionally home to a few fleas. Third, they brought animals inside. We've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. A pig in your living room wasn't just food for later, it was a living heater. And if you had more than one pig, congratulations, you were practically living in luxury. Fire hazards everywhere, of course. The hearth was the heart of the home. It cooked your meals, gave you light, and stopped your fingers from turning blue. But it was also a hazard. With a thatched roof above and straw all around, one stray spark could mean disaster. Fires were common, and losing your house in the middle of winter wasn't just inconvenient, it could be fatal. So families learned to manage fires carefully. Keep it small, keep it smoldering overnight, and never let it go out completely if you could help it. Relighting a fire in the morning was no joke when everything around you was frozen solid. Furniture, or lack of when it came to furniture. Don't picture big carved chairs or heavy wooden tables. Most peasants had very little: a rough table, a couple of benches, maybe a chest for storing clothes or tools. Beds, as mentioned, were often shared by multiple people. Curtains, cushions, and fancy decorations. Not really. The house wasn't a place to impress anyone, it was a place to stay alive. In winter, everything doubled up. Benches might hold food stores. Chests might be pushed near the fire to keep valuables from freezing. And yes, food was sometimes hung from the ceiling beams to keep rats and mice from stealing it. More than just shelter. Despite all the drafts, the smells, and the cramped quarters, these houses did their job. They kept peasants alive through some of the harshest winters in history. They weren't built for comfort, they were built for survival. And in a strange way, the closeness of the space reinforced community and family ties. When you're crammed into a smoky hut with 6 relatives and a cow, you learn patience. You also learn teamwork, keeping the fire going, patching the roof, and making sure no one freezes required everyone to pitch in. The contrast with nobles. It's tempting to think that nobles in castles had it way better. But here is a fun fact. Castles were also freezing. Stone walls held the cold like a giant refrigerator, and drafty halls weren't exactly cozy. Sure, they had tapestries, bigger fireplaces, and more blankets, but winter was still a challenge. In some ways, peasants in their small, animal-heated huts might have been just as warm as their lords. So while peasants' homes were humble, they weren't completely useless. They were just rough around the edges, very rough. Wrapping up the torso, as we step back out of our imaginary peasant hut and try not to breathe too deeply, we can see that these homes were far from glamorous. They were smoky, smelly, crowded, and drafty. But in a world without central heating, insulation, or double glazing, they were the best defense peasants had against the bitter cold. And honestly, there's something kind of admirable about that. They made do with what they had: sticks, mud, straw, and a whole lot of resilience. And somehow, year after year, these humble homes stood strong enough to see their families through the long, freezing nights of medieval winter. Fire and the hearth, the only heating system around, There was one thing standing between medieval peasants and freezing to death. It was the fire. Forget central heating, radiators, or electric heaters. This was a world where a single smoky hearth had to do all the heavy lifting. It cooked your food, lit your home, and most importantly, kept your fingers from snapping off like icicles. But relying on fire in a peasant house wasn't exactly a cozy fairy tale. It was smoky, dangerous, and constantly threatening to go out. Still, without it, life in the winter months would have been impossible. The hearth at the hearth really was the heart of the medieval peasant's home. Usually, it was nothing more than a simple pit or open fireplace in the middle of the room, sometimes with stones around it. Fancier setups might have a small chimney, but many homes just had a hole in the roof to let the smoke escape. And by escape, I mean about half of it went out the roof, while the other half lingered in the house, turning everyone's lungs into smoke detectors. You can imagine how smoky it was inside. Eyes stung, throats burned, and your clothes absorbed the smell so thoroughly that you probably smelled like a campfire year-round. On the bright side, the smoke did help keep away insects. On the not-so-bright side, you'd probably cough your way through dinner every night. Keeping it alive, one of the biggest challenges was keeping the fire going. You couldn't just flip a switch to turn it back on. Starting a fire from scratch took effort, time, and sometimes tools that weren't always available. So, once a fire was lit, families did everything they could to keep it smoldering through the night. Before bed, they might cover the embers with ash to slow down the burn, so by morning there'd still be a little heat to rekindle. Waking up to a completely dead fire in the middle of January was a nightmare scenario. Not only would the house freeze, but you'd also have to fumble around in the dark with flint and steel to spark a new one. And if your flint was lost, broken, or wet, you might be trudging across the village to borrow a flame from your neighbor. Imagine knocking on someone's door at dawn like, "Hey, can I borrow a cup of sugar?" Actually, scratch that, "Can I borrow your fire?" The problem of fuel, of course. None of this mattered if you didn't have fuel. Wood was the ideal choice, but peasants didn't always have easy access to forests. Many lords restricted tree cutting. Since timber was valuable for building, that meant peasants often had to scavenge for fallen branches, twigs, or anything burnable. When wood ran short, people turned to alternatives, like peat, basically blocks of dried up plant material cut from bogs. It burned slowly and produced a lot of smoke, but at least it burned. And when even peat wasn't available, well-dried animal dung made a decent stand-in. Yes, burning poop was part of medieval life. Not exactly the scent of luxury, but when it's a choice between smelly fire or frozen toes, you know which one wins. Fire as a cooking tool, the hearth wasn't just for warmth, it was also the kitchen. Everything from boiling gruel to baking bread happened over that open flame. Pots were hung from hooks or balanced on stones, while bread could be cooked on flat stones near the fire. Of course, cooking and heating at the same time wasn't always efficient. You might be warming yourself by the fire while accidentally inhaling enough smoke to season your dinner. And with no timers or ovens with neat little dials, cooking was more of an art than a science. Too close to the flames, and your bread turned into charcoal. Too far, and you'd still be chewing raw dough. Gathering around the fire for all its difficulties. The fire was the one thing that brought the family together. On long winter nights, everyone gathered around it not just for warmth, but also for company. People told stories, sang songs, played simple games, or just stared into the flames. The firelight created the only cozy glow they knew, flickering on the walls of their muddy little huts. In a way, it was the medieval version of Netflix, the evening entertainment you couldn't live without. Sure, it only had one-channel flames, and the plot was always the same: wood turns into ash, but it kept people captivated. Fire hazards, of course, with open flames inside straw-roofed, stick and mud houses. Things could go wrong quickly. One stray spark could set the thatch alight, and suddenly your home was less warm refuge and more bonfire. Fires were a real danger in medieval villages, and losing your house in the middle of winter could mean death for your whole family. That's why people learn to treat fire carefully. Keep it small, keep it steady, and keep an eye on the kids, so they didn't accidentally knock something flammable into it. You couldn't just grab a fire extinguisher. If things went bad, you had to beat at it with wet cloths, buckets of water, or sheer desperation. Symbolism and rituals beyond the practical side. Fire also carried deep meaning for medieval people. It symbolized life, protection, and God's light against the dark. Keeping the hearth fire alive wasn't just about warmth, it was about maintaining hope through the winter. In some places, rituals surrounded the care of the fire. For example, letting it go out was seen as unlucky, almost like inviting misfortune into the home. So when peasants gathered around the flames, they weren't just surviving the cold, they were also part of something bigger. Fire meant safety, community, and even a little touch of the divine in an otherwise harsh world. The unseen enemy. Smoke. One last thing. Imagine spending every winter night in a smoky room. Chimneys were rare in peasant houses until later in the Middle Ages, so the smoke had to escape through the roof or windows. That meant peasants basically lived in semi-smoky fog all winter. Long-term exposure probably caused breathing issues, but that wasn't something they could do much about. To them, watery eyes and coughing throats were just part of life, and yet they endured it, because the only alternative was a house without fire, and no one wanted to find out how long you could last in January without one. Wrapping up, so, when we think of medieval winters, the hearth really was everything. It was the heater, the stove, the light source, the gathering spot, and the soul of the house. It demanded constant care, filled your lungs with smoke, and sometimes smelled faintly of burning cow dung, but it kept you alive. Without fire, peasants wouldn't have stood a chance against the coldest nights. And so, even though it was messy, smoky, and dangerous, it was treasured, because in a medieval winter, the difference between life and death often came down to a flickering flame in the middle of a drafty hut. Bedding down, straw, furs, and sleeping in shifts when the fire burned low and the last scraps of food were gone, medieval peasants faced the hardest part of the winter night, actually getting some sleep. Sounds simple, right? Just lie down and close your eyes. But when the temperature outside was below freezing, and your house wasn't exactly airtight, falling asleep was less about comfort and more about survival. Forget memory foam mattresses or fluffy comforters. For peasants, bedding down usually meant making do with whatever materials they had: straw, old cloth, animal skins, and, very often, the warmth of other human bodies. The medieval mattress. Let's start with what you were sleeping on. A typical peasant bed wasn't some elegant four-poster draped in velvet. More often, it was a rough wooden frame stuffed with straw. Sometimes, it wasn't even a frame, just a heap of straw on the floor with a blanket thrown over it. Straw beds had their pros and cons. On the plus side, straw was cheap and widely available. You could gather it after harvest and replace it when it got too dirty. On the downside, it got dirty fast. Straw flattened quickly, grew damp in the winter air, and, worst of all, attracted pests. Fleas and lice loved straw beds almost as much as the people sleeping in them. So, if you were a peasant, bedtime often came with some extra itching. Layers on layers to fight the cold. People piled on whatever coverings they had. Wool blankets were common, since wool was warm even when damp. If you were lucky or had a generous lord, you might have a sheepskin or fur. Furs were prized in the cold months, not just for wearing, but for sleeping under. But here is the thing, most peasants didn't have enough blankets for everyone to sleep separately. Which brings us to the next part of the story, sharing a bed in the Middle Ages. Sharing a bed wasn't considered strange at all. Families, siblings, and sometimes even unrelated travelers might share the same sleeping space, not because they were overly affectionate, but because sharing body heat could literally save your life. Imagine 6 people bundled together under a heap of blankets and straw, all breathing in the same smoky air, trying to stay warm while the wind howled outside. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it worked. In fact, cuddling wasn't a romantic gesture. Most of the time, it was just physics. Of course, Sharing a bed also meant dealing with your brother kicking you in his sleep, or your mother snoring like a medieval bagpipe. But given the alternative freezing, most people put up with it. To sleeps, not one here is something you might find interesting. In medieval Europe, people often didn't sleep in one long stretch like we do today. Instead, they practiced what's called segmented sleep or two sleeps. Basically, they'd go to bed not long after dark, sleep for a few hours, then wake up around midnight. During this first sleep and second sleep, people might get up, stoke the fire, pray, talk quietly, or even do small chores. After an hour or two, they'd settle back in for the second sleep until morning. In winter, this made sense. Nights were long, and splitting up sleep gave people a chance to check on the fire or the animals. Plus, it meant fewer hours lying there freezing in bed, wishing morning would hurry up. Sleeping in shifts now, not every peasant got to sleep through the night, even into chunks. Sometimes, families took turns keeping watch. This wasn't because of burglars with ski masks, it was more about wolves, livestock, and fire safety. A stray spark could set the roof ablaze, and animals might need attention if they got restless. So in some households, one person might stay half awake while the others slept, just to make sure disaster didn't strike. It wasn't a fun job, but it was necessary. Imagine being the unlucky one shivering next to the fire at 3 a.m., poking the embers with a stick while everyone else snored away. Medieval life didn't hand out many perks. Pajamas, medieval style. What did people actually wear to bed? Spoiler, not cute pajamas with little ducks on them. Most peasants just wore the same clothes they'd had on all day. Undressing at night would have been unthinkable when your house was as cold as the outdoors. Woolen tunics, cloaks, or even just undergarments made of linen doubled as nightwear. In colder regions, hats and socks or at least cloth wrappings around the feet were common. So if you picture a medieval peasant in bed, don't think cozy nightgown. Think layered like an onion and still freezing. The bed as storage beds weren't just for sleeping either. In winter, peasants might store food under or near the bed to keep it from freezing. Tools, clothing, and valuables could also be tucked into the straw or hidden in blankets. With space so limited, every corner of the home had to do double duty. And if the family had a baby, cradles existed, but many infants simply slept in the bed with everyone else. That meant more warmth, but also less room and more chances of being kicked, rolled over, or woken by crying at midnight. Bedtime rituals before bed. Families often said prayers. In the Middle Ages, religion touched every part of life, and nighttime was no exception. Asking God for protection during the dark, cold hours was a regular part of winding down. Some people also told stories before sleep. Folktales, legends of sense, or just village gossip filled the long, dark evenings. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was a way to bond, to teach lessons, and to keep spirits up when the cold was pressing in from all sides. Comfort versus survival. When you put it all together, straw beds, itchy blankets, shared body heat, segmented sleep, it's clear that medieval peasants didn't aim for comfort the way we do today. Bedtime wasn't about curling up with a novel and drifting off peacefully. It was about doing whatever it took to survive the night. And yet, in its own way, there was a kind of coziness. Families huddled together, firelight flickering on the walls, stories whispered into the dark. Sure, you might wake up scratching from fleas or with a frozen nose, but you were alive. And for peasants, that was good enough. Wrapping up, so, when medieval peasants bedded down for the night, it wasn't pretty. It was itchy, crowded, and cold, but it was also practical. They turned straw into mattresses, old clothes into blankets, and family members into radiators. They split their sleep, shared their space with animals, and kept one eye on the fire. It might sound miserable to us, but it worked. And as the snow piled up outside and the winter dragged on, these nightly survival routines kept peasants alive until spring finally broke through. Clothing for the cold, layers, wool, and hand-me-downs. When winter came knocking in the Middle Ages, Peasants didn't exactly have the luxury of popping down to a shop for a new puffer jacket. No heated gloves, no fleece-lined boots, no cozy scarves from grandma. Instead, they relied on the materials they had, mostly wool, sometimes leather, and often clothing that had been patched, repatched, and handed down through 3 generations. Staying warm wasn't about fashion. It was about piling on whatever you had and hoping it would keep the frostbite away. Wool, the medieval super material. If medieval clothing had a superhero, it would be wool. Sheep were everywhere, and their wool was the backbone of peasant clothing. Why? Because wool is warm, durable, and crucially still insulates even when damp. That made it perfect for the damp, chilly winters of Europe. Tunics, cloaks, stockings, and hoods were all made of wool. It wasn't soft and fluffy like the sweaters you might be imagining. It was coarse, sometimes itchy, and definitely not stylish. But peasants weren't out to impress anyone. They were out to avoid freezing solid in the middle of January. And while nobles could afford brightly dyed wool in reds, blues, or greens, peasants usually wore natural, dull colors: brown, grey, off-white. Basically, the fashion palette of a medieval village looked like 50 shades of mud. Layers on layers. Winter clothing strategy was simple: layer everything you owned. Linen shirts or undergarments went on first. Over that came woolen tunics, then a cloak or mantle for extra warmth. If you had a hood, even better, it kept your head and neck covered, which was crucial since hats were basically the medieval version of central heating. Footwear was another story. Peasants wore simple leather shoes, often stuffed with straw or rags in winter to add insulation. Socks, as we know them, didn't really exist, but woolen hose long stockings did. Still, keeping your feet warm and dry was a losing battle most of the time. Mud, snow, and cold soaked through everything. If you've ever had soggy socks, just imagine that feeling every day for months. Hand-me-downs and repairs. New clothes were rare for peasants. Most garments were handed down from parents to children, patched endlessly, or even taken apart and remade into something else. A cloak might start its life with the father, then pass to the mother, then finally be cut down into smaller pieces for the kids. By the time a piece of clothing reached its final owner, it probably looked more like a rag than a garment. Repairing clothes was a constant chore. Holes were patched, tears stitched, and worn-out shoes stuffed with whatever could keep them together for another week. Throwing clothes away simply wasn't an option. Everything was reused until it literally fell apart. Furs, for the lucky furs, were highly prized in winter. Even a simple sheepskin could make a huge difference on a freezing night. Peasants didn't usually have access to expensive furs like ermine or sable that was noble stuff, but they might use rabbit, sheep, goat, or if really lucky, a bit of deer hide. Wearing fur wasn't about fashion, it was pure survival. A fur-lined cloak or hood could mean the difference between shivering through the night or actually getting some rest. If you were wealthy enough or had good hunting skills, you might even sleep directly on animal hides for extra warmth. The everyday outfit. So, what did a typical peasant wear on a winter's day? Probably something like this: a rough linen shirt or shift against the skin, a wool tunic layered on top, hose long stockings covering the legs, a cloak or mantle fastened with a simple pin or brooch, leather shoes, maybe stuffed with straw, a hood, cap, or even just a cloth wrapped around the head. Basically, you looked like a bundle of wool and leather. And since laundry was rare in winter because washing clothes in freezing water wasn't exactly fun, you probably wore the same outfit for weeks. Clothes and social status. Even though peasants weren't focused on fashion, clothing still marked your place in society. Laws called sumptuary laws sometimes restricted what people could wear, making sure peasants didn't dress above their station. Not that many peasants could afford fancy clothes anyway. Still, even the humblest tunic told a story. The quality of the wool, the neatness of the stitches, the presence or absence of color, these little details could reveal whether you were scraping by at the very bottom or slightly better off. Winter work clothes. Clothing wasn't just for staying warm while sleeping. Peasants still had to work in winter, feeding animals, gathering wood, repairing tools, and sometimes trudging through snow. That meant clothing had to be practical. Cloaks could be thrown over anything, doubling as blankets when needed. Hoods were essential, since losing body heat through the head was as much a problem then as it is now. Mittens or gloves existed, but many peasants just wrapped their hands in cloth or relied on keeping them tucked into cloaks. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept you functional. When clothes weren't enough even with layers of wool, winter was brutal. Clothes could only do so much against icy winds, leaky roofs, and freezing nights. That's why peasants combined warm clothing with other survival tricks, huddling by the fire, piling under shared blankets, or cuddling up with livestock. Clothes weren't the whole solution, they were just one part of the bigger fight against winter. Wrapping up. So, medieval peasant winter fashion wasn't about turning heads or making a statement, it was about survival. Wool was the MVP, furs were gold, and everything was patched until it couldn't be patched anymore. If you were a peasant in January, your outfit probably smelled smoky, looked ragged, and felt itchy. But it kept you alive, and in a world where freezing to death was a real possibility, that was the only stale point that mattered. Winter food, gruel, bread, and whatever didn't rot. If staying warm was half the battle of surviving winter in the Middle Ages, staying fed was the other half. And unlike today, when you can raid the fridge or order a pizza, medieval peasants had to rely on whatever they'd managed to grow, dry, or store before the cold came rolling in. And let's be honest, winter meals weren't exactly a feast. Think less buffet and more please. Let there be something edible in this pot. The hungry season. Winter was called the hungry season for a reason. Fresh food disappeared once the fields froze, gardens withered, and fruit trees went bare. The only things on the menu were what you had saved from summer and fall. If you planned well, you made it through. If not, well, hunger was going to be your dinner guest for months. Peasants didn't usually starve to death, but being underfed was normal. Weakness, fatigue, and constant grumbling stomachs were just part of life. Bread. The daily staple bread was the backbone of the medieval diet. Not fluffy white loaves, though. That was for the wealthy. Peasant bread was usually made from rye, barley, or oats, dense, dark, and sometimes sour. Wheat bread, which we think of as normal today, was a luxury for nobles. In winter, bread might be stretched even further by mixing in peas, beans, or even acorns if grain supplies were short. Imagine biting into a loaf and crunching a hidden acorn. Not gourmet, but it filled the stomach. Bread wasn't just food, it was also the plate. Thick slices could be used as trenchers, absorbing stew or broth before being eaten or given to animals if they got too soggy. Gruel and porridge if bread was the staple. Gruel was the fallback. Gruel was basically a thin porridge made from boiling grain in water. Add a little milk if you had it, maybe a sprinkle of herbs if you were lucky, but most of the time it was bland and soupy. When supplies were tighter, porridge became thicker and more filling. It might include beans, peas, onions, or whatever scraps were lying around. In a way, it was medieval leftover soup. Not tasty, but hot and warming. And in winter, that counted for a lot. Dried, pickled, and smoked preservation was the name of the game. Without refrigerators, peasants had to find creative ways to keep food from spoiling. Drying, beans, peas, and herbs were dried during the summer to last through the cold months. Pickling. Vegetables like cabbage or turnips could be pickled in brine. Think of it as medieval sauerkraut. Smoking and salting, meat and fish, when peasants actually had any, were smoked or salted to last. A salted herring, for example, could survive weeks in storage. Still, preserved food was often tough, salty, or sour. Not a treat, but at least it meant you had something to chew on. Vegetables and legumes. Fresh vegetables weren't an option in winter. Instead, peasants relied on storage crops, things like onions, garlic, turnips, and cabbage that could last in a cellar or pit. Legumes like peas and beans were especially important. They were filling, easy to dry, and provided much needed protein when meat was rare. A pot of peas or beans simmering over the fire could stretch to feed the whole family. The rare treat of meat was not a daily item for peasants. And in winter, it became even rarer. Animals were expensive to feed through the cold months, so many were slaughtered in autumn. The meat was preserved, but it didn't last forever. A peasant might eat bacon, salted pork, or dried fish if they were fortunate, but often the meat flavor in winter meals came from tossing a bone into the pot just to get some taste into the broth. If you did get a bit of fresh meat in January, it probably meant you had a chicken that stopped laying eggs or a rabbit that was too tempting to ignore. Dairy, when possible milk, butter, and cheese were valuable, but not always available. Cows and goats produced less milk in winter, since they were eating less fresh food. Butter and cheese made earlier in the year might still be around, but these were usually rationed carefully. Cheese, especially hard varieties, was useful because it lasted longer. A hunk of cheese could be shaved into porridge or bread to give some extra flavor. Drinking in the cold, what did peasants wash all this down with? Water wasn't always safe, especially if it came from a stagnant source. Instead, they drank weak ale, cider, or diluted wine if available. Ale was the most common. It wasn't strong, but it was filling and safer than water. Hot drinks like tea or coffee didn't exist in medieval Europe yet, so if you were hoping for a steaming mug of cocoa by the fire, sorry, at best you got warm ale or a simple herbal infusion. Food anxiety, one of the hardest parts of winter, wasn't just the bland food. It was the constant anxiety of not knowing if you had enough. Every day you dipped into your stores, and every day the pole grew smaller. By February or March, many peasants were on edge, hoping spring came before the last of the bread ran out. That's why community sharing was so important. Villagers might trade or pool resources to help each other through. Still, it was a thin margin between survival and disaster. The reality of feast and famine. Peasants lived on a cycle of plenty and scarcity. After the autumn harvest, there was food everywhere. But as winter dragged on, the abundance vanished. It wasn't unusual for peasants to look forward to Lent in spring, not just for religious reasons, but because fasting was easier when you didn't have much food left anyway. The rhythm of the year shaped everything. Winter meant hunger, patience, and waiting for the fields to wake up again. Wrapping up, so, what was winter food like for a medieval peasant? In short, bread, porridge, beans, and whatever didn't rot in storage. Add some salty fish, if you were lucky, and maybe a little cheese for flavor. It wasn't a menu that would win awards, but it kept people alive. And in the Middle Ages, survival was the only recipe that really mattered. Work in the frost, farming, fixing, and surviving. When you picture medieval peasants in winter, you might imagine them huddled indoors all day, wrapped in wool, sipping thin ale by the fire. Sounds cozy, right? Unfortunately, reality was less winter break and more there's always something that needs doing. Even when your toes are frozen, winter didn't stop work. It just changed the kind of work peasants did. Fields might be resting under snow, but peasants never really got to rest themselves. Farming didn't fully stop. True, you couldn't plow frozen ground, and crops weren't growing when the fields were covered in frost. But that didn't mean peasants put their feet up until spring. Instead, they turned to tasks that prepared for the next season. Tools had to be repaired, plows fixed, and carts mended. If something broke in summer, and you were too busy to deal with it, winter was the time to finally fix it. Basically, it was the medieval version of "I'll get around to it later." Winter was also the season for gathering manure. Yes, manure. Animal droppings were collected and stored to fertilize fields once the thaw came. Imagine trudging through snow, shovel in hand, collecting steaming piles of future harvest. Glamorous? Not at all. Necessary? Absolutely. Firewood, and more firewood. Keeping warm meant keeping the fire alive, and that required endless firewood. Gathering, chopping, and stacking wood was one of the biggest winter jobs. Peasants often had to trudge into the woods with axes, even when the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Cutting down trees and splitting logs wasn't just hard, it was exhausting. But without it, You risked freezing at night. Wood also wasn't just for warmth. It was the fuel for cooking, boiling water, and drying out damp clothes. A good stack of wood meant a safer winter. A poor stack meant shivering and hunger. Caring for animals didn't hibernate just because it was cold. Cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens still needed feeding and care every single day. Peasants had to trudge out to barns and pens to check on them, often in the dark, since daylight was short in winter. Animals were given hay, grain, or whatever scraps could be spared. Water had to be broken free of ice in troughs, and mucking out stalls never stopped. Animals still made messes, even in January. In fact, animals were often more vulnerable in winter. If they grew too thin, they wouldn't survive until spring. Losing a cow or goat wasn't just sad, it could mean disaster for a family's milk supply. So peasants worked hard to keep their animals alive, even if it meant giving them some of their own food. Home repairs and maintenance houses weren't built to last forever. Roofs leaked, walls sagged, and drafts crept in. Winter was a constant battle against the cold sneaking inside. Peasants patched holes with mud and straw, stuffed rags into gaps, and did their best to keep huts from collapsing under heavy snow. If a roof beam cracked in January, you couldn't just ignore it. You had to fix it before the whole roof caved in. Winter repairs also extended to clothing. When you couldn't work outdoors, you patched garments, stitched new cloaks, or refitted shoes. Every spare moment indoors was a chance to keep your stuff in one piece. Household work never ended. Indoor chores didn't stop just because it was winter. Women especially kept busy with spinning, weaving, and sewing. Wool from sheep shorn earlier in the year could be spun into yarn and woven into cloth. That meant new clothes, blankets, or even sacks for storage. Children helped too, of course. They gathered kindling, helped feed animals, and fetched water when streams weren't completely frozen. Everyone had a role, no matter their age. Hunting and gathering. Not every peasant had the right to hunt. Laws often restricted game to nobles, but that didn't mean peasants never tried. In desperate times, a rabbit snared in the woods or a bird caught in a trap could make the difference between a full belly and an empty one. Gathering also continued. Even in winter, people collected nuts left from autumn, roots dug from the ground, or berries that clung stubbornly to bushes. It wasn't much, but every handful counted. Work and community. Winter work wasn't always done alone. Villagers often banded together to cut wood, repair fences, or help each other with heavy tasks. In small communities, survival depended on cooperation. If one family lost a cow or ran low on grain, others might pitch in, not out of pure generosity, because everyone knew that someday they might need help too. Winter was too harsh for selfishness. Rest was rare, yes. Days were shorter in winter, and nights were long, but that didn't mean peasants spent extra hours snoozing by the fire. If you didn't keep up with chores, things quickly fell apart. Fires went out, animals got sick, roofs leaked, and food spoiled. Still, winter did offer brief pockets of rest. With fields lying dormant, there were moments when peasants could sit indoors, tell stories, play simple games, or sing by the fire. These little pauses helped break up the grind, but overall, life was still work heavy, just in different ways than summer. Wrapping up. So, what did peasants do in the frost? They chopped endless firewood, cared for animals, patched homes, mended clothes, and prepared for the next planting season. The fields might have been quiet, but the peasants weren't. Winter wasn't a holiday, it was just another season of survival. Every chore, no matter how small, helped keep families alive until spring. And if you ever feel lazy about taking out the trash on a cold night, just remember, at least you don't have to collect frozen manure with numb fingers. Animals in the house, warmth and practicality. When you think about medieval peasants trying to survive winter, you probably imagine them gathered around a smoky fire, wrapped in wool blankets, maybe sipping thin ale. What you might not picture is a cow standing in the corner of the room, or a pig snuffling near the door. But for many peasants, that's exactly how winter nights went down. It wasn't just a funny idea, it was survival. Animals in the house meant warmth, food security, and sometimes even company. Sure, it was a little messy. Okay, very messy. But in a world without central heating, practicality came first. Why bring animals inside? Simple answer: heat. Animals, especially big ones like cows, give off a surprising amount of warmth. A cow can produce more heat than a small fireplace just by existing. Sheep, goats, and pigs also worked like little furry heaters. So instead of leaving animals to freeze in a flimsy barn, many peasants kept them inside or in an attached shed. Everyone benefited. The animals stayed alive, and the humans got a boost of warmth. Think of it as medieval central heating powered by mooing, bang, and the occasional oink. The layout of a peasant house. Peasant homes weren't huge. Most were 1 or 2 rooms, built from wood, wattle and daub sticks and mud, or stone. Roofs were thatched, floors were often just dirt, and smoke from the hearth drifted wherever it wanted. Animals usually had a space near the door or in a side stall. Bigger houses might have a small section walled off for livestock. In simpler cottages, animals and humans basically shared the same space. You could wake up in the night, roll over, and find yourself nose to nose with a sheep. Which animals came inside? Not every creature from the barnyard got a ticket indoors. The usual winter house guests included cows. Their body heat was precious, and they were too valuable to risk losing. Sheep and goats, smaller but still good for warmth and for milk when they were producing. Pigs, tough little survivors, but piglets especially needed shelter from the cold. Chickens, sometimes kept in baskets or perches indoors, mainly to protect them from predators. Horses usually stayed in stables, since they needed more space, but smaller animals were fair game for the living room. The smell factor now. Let's be honest, this setup didn't exactly smell like roses. A mix of smoke from the fire, damp wool, and animal droppings hung in the air. Floors were dirty, and cleaning was minimal, but peasants were used to it. For them, the trade-off was worth it. Better to have a smelly, but warm home than a clean, freezing one. And besides, medieval noses were probably more forgiving than ours. Animals as security. Having animals indoors wasn't just about warmth, it was also about protection. Predators like wolves, foxes, or even thieves could snatch livestock as they were left outside. By bringing animals in, peasants reduced the risk. It was much harder for someone to steal your goat if it was sleeping by your bed. Food on 4 legs. In a way, winter animals were like living savings accounts. Cows gave milk if they were producing, chickens laid eggs, and goats could provide both milk and meat if needed. Keeping them alive through the harsh months was vital for survival. Bringing animals indoors helped make sure those precious food sources didn't die in the cold. Losing even 1 cow could be devastating for a peasant family. Children and animals for children. Having animals indoors was probably normal. Kids grew up sharing space with goats, pigs, and chickens. They might have helped feed them, cleaned up after them, lucky kids, or even snuggled up next to them for warmth at night. It's easy to imagine a child drifting off to sleep to the sound of a cow chewing cud in the background, or a chicken clucking softly from its perch. Not exactly a lullaby, but it was home. Seasonal arrangements. Animals didn't stay indoors all year. This was mainly a winter setup. Once spring arrived, livestock went back outside to graze. Barns and sheds were put to use again, and peasants reclaimed their space. But during those brutal January nights, when frost crept through the cracks and snow piled against the door, sharing a home with animals wasn't optional, it was smart. A touch of community. In some villages, peasants even shared barns or shelters with neighbors. If one family had a sturdier building, animals from several households might be crammed in together. That meant more warmth, more noise, and probably more chaos. But it also built community bonds. When survival is on the line, cooperation often beats comfort. Wrapping up. So yes, many medieval peasants really did share their homes with animals during the coldest months. It wasn't glamorous. It was noisy, smelly, and crowded. But it kept families and their livestock alive, which was all that mattered. When you picture a medieval winter night, don't just think of peasants huddled around a fire. Picture them with a cow breathing in the corner, pigs rustling near the door, and chickens fluttering on their perches. It wasn't cozy by modern standards, but in the Middle Ages, survival often looked a lot like chaos. Health in the cold, coughs, frostbite, and old remedies. If you've ever had the flu in winter, you know how miserable it can be. Now, imagine being a medieval peasant, lying in a smoky, drafty hut, wrapped in itchy wool, with no medicine except whatever herbs your neighbor swore by. That was winter health in the Middle Ages: cold air outside, cold germs inside, and very little to fight them with. The cold brought more than just shivers. Winter didn't just test peasants' strength, it tested their immune systems. Dampness, poor diet, and constant exposure to smoke made people vulnerable to sickness. Colds, coughs, fevers, and lung problems spread quickly in cramped homes, and without our modern comforts, no cough syrup, no antibiotics, no fuzzy socks, you just had to tough it out and hope your body pulled through. Coughs and lung problems with fires burning constantly indoors, smoke-filled peasant homes. Chimneys weren't common in the simplest cottages, so smoke often hung thick in the air. Breathing that in every day wasn't exactly healthy. The result: coughing. Lots and lots of coughing. Winter nights were filled with the sound of hacking, wheezing, and sniffles. Children, the elderly, and anyone with weak lungs suffered most. Some people probably developed what we'd now call bronchitis or even pneumonia. But in medieval times, it was just seen as the winter sickness, and too often, it could be fatal. Frostbite and freezing. Frostbite wasn't as common as you might think. Peasants knew how to layer wool and huddle by fires, but it did happen. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were vulnerable if you spent too long outside chopping wood or tending animals. Severe cases could mean permanent damage. Losing a toe or two wasn't unheard of, and while that sounds extreme, peasants often shrug it off as just another part of life. You couldn't exactly call in sick if your foot hurt. You still had animals to feed. Malnutrition and weakness. The biggest health problem in winter wasn't frostbite, it was hunger. A diet of bread, porridge, and maybe beans didn't provide all the vitamins and nutrients people needed. Lack of fresh food meant peasants were often undernourished, leaving their bodies weak and more vulnerable to illness. Children might grow slowly, wounds healed poorly, and even small sicknesses hit harder when your body didn't have enough fuel. The winter fevers, illnesses we'd now identify as influenza or other viral fevers, swept through villages in the cold months. Crowded homes made it easy for sickness to spread, and there was little understanding of how disease worked. People blamed bad air, evil spirits, or even divine punishment. Washing hands wasn't common practice, so germs had a field day. If one family member got sick, it usually wasn't long before the rest followed. Old remedies and folk cures, without doctors nearby, and without money to pay them, as they were, peasants relied on folk remedies. Some of these actually had a bit of merit, others not so much. Herbs, garlic, sage, thyme, and onion were used in teas, poultices, or broths to fight sickness. Honey, known for soothing throats and healing wounds, honey was a valuable medicine. Ale and wine. Weak ale was sometimes warmed and spiced for coughs. Wine might be used to clean wounds. Charms and prayers. Many people believed sickness could be warded off with charms, blessings, or simply praying for relief. Some remedies worked by accident, but many were more about comfort and hope than real healing. Midwives and wise women in many villages. Knowledge of healing rested with midwives, also called wise women. These women knew herbs, poultices, and simple treatments. They weren't trained doctors, but they often had more practical knowledge than anyone else around. Their cures might include herbal teas for coughs, poultices for wounds, or advice on rest and warmth. Some people trusted them deeply. Others whispered that their powers were suspicious to close to witchcraft. But in times of illness, most peasants would gladly take help from anyone who offered it. Winter injuries. It wasn't just sickness that made winter dangerous. Everyday chores carried risks too. Slipping on ice while carrying wood, cutting yourself with an axe, or getting burned by the fire all were common. In a world without proper medical care, Even small injuries could become serious. A cut could turn infected. A broken bone could heal badly and leave someone crippled. The line between a small accident and a lifelong problem was razor thin. The role of faith when remedies failed. Peasants often turned to faith. Illness was seen as part of God's will, or perhaps punishment for sins. People prayed for healing, visited shrines, or asked priests for blessings. This gave comfort, even if it didn't cure. In a world full of uncertainty, belief was often the strongest medicine people had. The hardest losses sadly. Winter sickness often claimed the weakest, infants, children, and the elderly. Death was a familiar part of life, and while families grieved, they also accepted it as part of the harsh cycle of the seasons. Communities rallied around those in need, but there was only so much they could do. The cold months were a test, and not everyone passed. Wrapping up so, what was health like for peasants in winter? Imagine constant coughing, smoky lungs, aching bones, and empty stomachs. Remedies were a mix of herbs, honey, prayers, and guesswork. Some helped, others were just hopeful gestures. But peasants endured. Even when sickness lingered, even when food ran low, they kept going. Surviving the cold wasn't just about warmth or food, it was about resilience. And while many winters brought suffering, they also showed the stubborn strength of people who refused to give up. The community factor, sharing, helping, and gossiping surviving winter in the Middle Ages wasn't something peasants could do all alone. Sure, you could chop your own firewood, patch your own roof, and boil your own porridge, but if you tried to get through the whole season solo, chances were slim. The truth was simple. Winter was a team sport. Villages worked together, families leaned on each other, and even gossip by the fire served a purpose. Life in the cold wasn't just about warmth or food. It was about community. Strength in numbers. Peasant villages were small, often just a handful of families clustered around a church, a manor, or a crossroads. Everyone knew each other, sometimes a little too well, but this closeness meant survival. If one family's cow stopped giving milk, neighbors might share. If a roof caved in after heavy snow, the whole village pitched in to fix it. Helping each other wasn't just kindness, it was insurance. You gave today, knowing that someday you'd need help, too. Shared work. Winter work was often easier when done together. Gathering firewood, repairing fences, or clearing snow went faster with extra hands. Men might team up to chop trees, while women joined forces to spin wool or prepare food. Children played their part too. They fetched water, carried bundles of sticks, or helped look after animals. And while they probably complained, because children always complain, their work mattered. These shared chores built bonds. No one in a medieval village could afford to be lazy, because everyone noticed, and no one liked a slacker when survival was on the line. Food sharing and trading. Winter pantries could be unpredictable. One family might have too much grain, but no beans, while another had beans, but little bread. Trading was common, swapping food, tools, or favors to balance things out. In really hard times, sharing became essential. A neighbor might slip you a loaf of bread or some dried peas, knowing that you'd return the favor when you could. Was it always equal? No, but generosity, even in small amounts, helped villages survive. Storytelling by the fire. Long nights needed entertainment, and this often came in the form of storytelling. Families gathered around the hearth, and tales of saints, heroes, or mischievous spirits filled the smoky air. Sometimes the stories taught lessons like warnings against greed or laziness. Other times they were just for fun. Gossip often slipped in too. Who was courting who was lazy in the fields, or who secretly borrowed a chicken without asking. It might seem trivial, but this chatter was important. Stories and gossip bonded people together, gave them something to laugh about, and made the endless nights feel less heavy. Winter celebrations. Even in the hardest times, peasants found ways to celebrate. Religious festivals like Christmas or Candlemas gave people an excuse to gather, feast, and forget their worries for a while. These moments of joy weren't just distractions, they were reminders that life had meaning beyond survival. Singing, dancing, and feasting, even if it was just on bread and ale, gave peasants strength to push through the cold months. The role of the church, the village church, wasn't just a place of worship. It was a hub of community life. During winter, the church brought people together for services, festivals, and even charity. Wealthier villagers or the local lord might donate food to the needy, especially around Christmas. Priests also provided comfort when illness struck or when hunger loomed. Faith tied the village together, reminding everyone that they weren't suffering alone. Mutual protection. Winter brought dangers beyond cold and hunger. Wolves might come closer to villages in search of food, and thieves sometimes tried to steal livestock or grain. A single family couldn't defend themselves easily, but a village could. That's why communities kept a watchful eye out. Neighbors looked after each other's homes, and if trouble came, everyone responded. Survival wasn't just about warmth. It was about safety in numbers. The importance of gossip. It might sound funny, but gossip was serious business. News of sickness, shortages, or misbehavior spread quickly. Gossip acted like a medieval social media feed. Everyone knew who was struggling, who needed help, and who wasn't pulling their weight. Of course, gossip could also be cruel, but in its own way, it kept people accountable. If you ignored your duties or refused to help others, you'd hear about it, and no one wanted to be the subject of the village's winter chatter. Community and resilience. When you put it all together, winter survival in the Middle Ages wasn't just about food, clothing, or firewood. It was about cooperation. A family alone might falter, but a village could endure. Shared work, shared food, and shared stories turned bitter nights into something bearable. In the constant battle against cold and hunger, community was the secret weapon. Wrapping up, so how did peasants survive those freezing nights? Yes, they had fire, wool, and simple meals, but just as important was the support of neighbors, the comfort of shared stories, and the knowledge that they weren't facing winter alone. In the end, community was the true blanket that kept medieval peasants warm. Faith in the freeze, religion, and winter survival. For medieval peasants, surviving the cold wasn't just about piling on wool or finding enough firewood. It was also about belief. Faith ran through every part of life, and winter was no exception. The church gave meaning to the suffering, explained the dangers, and offered hope that spring would eventually return. When the nights grew long and the cold gnawed at the bones, prayer and ritual could feel as important as food or fire. The church at the center. Every village had a church, usually the sturdiest building around. For peasants, it wasn't just a place for Sunday services, it was the heart of community life. In winter, when work in the fields slowed, people gathered at the church more often. Services, holy days, and prayers gave structure to days that might otherwise feel endless. The church calendar, filled with feasts and saints' days, was like a guidebook for surviving the seasons. It reminded people that winter was part of God's design, not just random misery. Understanding the cold, peasants didn't know about germs, weather systems, or vitamin deficiencies. Instead, faith explained the harsh world around them. A sudden snowstorm, a test from God, a deadly illness, punishment for sins, a mild winter, a blessing from heaven. This worldview gave peasants a way to make sense of suffering. It might not have cured frostbite, but it gave the struggle a story, sense and protection. When life got tough, peasants often called on saints for help. Different saints were thought to guard against different dangers. St. Blaise was believed to protect throats, very useful when coughs spread in the cold. St. Roch was called on during times of plague and sickness. St. Nicholas, yes, that St. Nicholas was connected to charity and children, which made him especially popular in winter. Villagers prayed to these figures, lit candles, or made small offerings, hoping for protection through the hardest nights. Rituals and blessings. The church also offered rituals to guard against winter dangers. Priests blessed food, animals, and homes, asking God's favor. On Candlemas in February, candles were blessed and distributed, symbolizing light pushing back the darkness. Even the act of gathering together in church made people feel safer. The walls might have been cold, but the sense of unity and the chanting of prayers brought warmth of a different kind. The fear of punishment faith brought comfort, but it also carried fear. Harsh winters were sometimes seen as divine punishment for sin. If crops failed or people starved, whispers spread that God was angry. This could lead to repentance rituals, fasting, or public prayers. People tried to set things right with heaven, hoping mercy would come before it was too late. The hope of spring religion didn't just explain the suffering it promised, that better times would come. The cycle of the church year reflected the cycle of the seasons. After the cold darkness of winter came the joy of Easter, tied closely to spring. This gave peasants something to hold on to during endless nights. Even when food was scarce and sickness spread, faith reminded them that winter wouldn't last forever. Pilgrimages and holy sites not every peasant could travel, but some braved the cold to visit shrines or holy wells, believed to have healing powers. These journeys were acts of devotion and desperation, seeking cures for sickness or protection for families. A bit of icy mud on the road was nothing if you believed a saint could save your child from fever. Everyday prayers, of course. Faith wasn't just about big festivals or pilgrimages. It was also woven into daily survival. A whispered prayer before sleep, a cross made over food, a plea for safety before heading out into the snow. These small rituals reminded peasants that they weren't alone. In a world where so much felt beyond control, prayer gave a sense of agency. You couldn't stop the snow, but you could ask for help to endure it. Faith as comfort for many peasants. Faith was less about strict theology and more about comfort, believing that God watched over them, that saints cared, and that suffering had meaning made the cold more bearable. Even when food ran low and sickness spread, people clung to faith. It was a blanket for the spirit, just as war was a blanket for the body. Wrapping up, so how did religion help peasants through winter? It explained the storms, gave people figures to pray to, and filled the long nights with rituals and hope. Faith didn't keep toes from freezing, but it did keep spirits from breaking. When the fire burned low and the hunger grew sharp, belief in God and the promise of spring gave peasants the strength to survive one more night. Entertainment indoors, storytelling, games, and songs when the nights were long, the wind howled, and the fire burned low. Medieval peasants needed something to pass the time. You couldn't just grab a blanket and binge watch a show. Books were rare, expensive, and mostly in Latin, which peasants didn't read. So what did they do? They turned to each other. Entertainment in winter wasn't about screens or gadgets. It was about stories, music, and simple games that kept spirits alive when the world outside felt frozen solid. The hearth as a stage. The center of the peasant home was the hearth. By day, it cooked food. By night, it became the stage. Families and sometimes neighbors gathered close, not just for warmth, but for company. The flicker of firelight made the perfect backdrop for storytelling. Shadows danced on the walls, and the smell of smoke hung in the air. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the kind of atmosphere that made every tale feel alive. Storytelling traditions. Storytelling was a favorite pastime, and it came in many forms. Some tales were serious legends of saints, Bible stories, or moral lessons meant to guide behavior. Others were lighter, filled with local gossip, humor, or spooky twists. Peasants loved stories of brave knights, cunning tricksters, and magical creatures. Even if most of them never met a knight in real life, these tales offered escape from the daily grind. Children listened wide-eyed, and even adults leaned in, eager for distraction. A good storyteller was as valuable as a good carpenter, because laughter and wonder were as necessary as bread. Songs and music. Where there were people, there was music. Peasants sang songs, sometimes work songs, sometimes drinking songs, sometimes ballads that told long stories. Singing was free, and anyone could join in. Simple instruments made appearances too. A shepherd's pipe, a drum, or a homemade fiddle might accompany the voices. You didn't need a polished performance. You just needed rhythm to pass the time. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was bonding. Voices joined together reminded peasants that even in the darkest months, They weren't alone. Games for long nights, board games, as we know them, weren't common. But peasants had simple pastimes. Dice games were popular, though frowned upon by the church, because gambling often followed. Pebbles, sticks, or carved tokens could serve as game pieces. Children played guessing games or sang rhymes. Adults sometimes played strategy games passed down through tradition, testing patience and wits. And let's be honest, sometimes the game was simply teasing your sibling until someone yelled. Some things never change. Spooky tales. Winter nights were the perfect time for ghost stories, with the wind rattling shutters and wolves howling in the distance. It wasn't hard to believe in spirits lurking just outside. Stories of restless souls, wandering demons, or witches in the woods added a thrill to the evening. Fear had a strange way of making people feel more alive and more grateful for the safety of the fire. Gossip as entertainment. Not every story was about saints or spirits. Gossip filled the long hours, too. Who had been lazy in the fields? Who might be secretly courting? Who borrowed a tool and didn't return it? Gossip was more than entertainment. It was social glue. It kept people aware of each other's lives, for better or worse. And let's be honest, a little scandal helped the nights go by faster. Festivals and gatherings. Though daily life indoors was simple, winter also brought special events. Feast days and celebrations gave peasants a reason to gather, dance, and enjoy themselves. Music, dancing, and even small plays brightened the gloom. Sometimes traveling entertainers passed through, bringing juggling, acrobatics, or songs from faraway places. These visits were rare, but unforgettable. Laughter in the cold. It's easy to imagine medieval peasants as endlessly grim, but humor was always part of life. Jokes, pranks, and playful banter filled the dark hours. A shared laugh warmed the spirits almost as much as the fire. In fact, humor might have been one of the best survival tools peasants had. When food was low and cold crept in, laughter reminded people that they were still human, that winter didn't own their joy. Entertainment with a purpose. Many forms of entertainment carried hidden lessons. Stories warned against greed or laziness. Songs remembered history or praised local heroes. Games taught strategy and patience. So while peasants were having fun, they were also learning. Culture wasn't written down in books, it was passed on by word of mouth. From fire to fire, night to night. Wrapping up. So what did peasants do on the coldest nights? They told stories, sang songs, played games, shared gossip, and sometimes scared each other with ghost tales. It wasn't glamorous. There were no fireworks, no cinemas, no cozy movie nights. But in its own way, it was rich. Entertainment wasn't just distraction, it was connection. And for medieval peasants, connection was the warmth that kept the long winter nights from swallowing them whole. The fear of famine. When winter lasted too long, there was one shadow that hung over every medieval winter. It wasn't just the cold, it was hunger. The kind of hunger that went beyond a missed meal. The kind that gnawed at you day after day. When cupboards were empty and fields were frozen solid. For peasants, the fear of famine was as real as the frost on their roofs. Every winter carried the question, would the food last until spring? The yearly gamble. Farming was a gamble, and peasants knew it. You harvested in autumn, stored what you could, and prayed it would last. Grain, beans, salted meat, and dried peas went into storage. If the harvest was good, you might make it through. If it was bad, well, the outlook wasn't pretty. Winter wasn't just cold, it was dead time. Fields couldn't grow new crops, and animals ate from the stores instead of grazing. That meant supplies only went one way, down. Every passing week meant one less bag of grain, one less barrel of ale, one less salted fish. The lean months. Medieval people even had a name for it, the hungry gap. This was the stretch of late winter and early spring when supplies were lowest, but new food hadn't yet grown. Imagine scraping the bottom of the grain bin, watching the last loaves get smaller, and trying to stretch stew with more water than peas. People became inventive with what little they had. Sometimes that meant eating food normally given to animals, or worse, boiling things no one should really eat. Hunger and weakness. When food ran low, the body weakened. Malnutrition set in. Children were especially at risk, growing thin and frail. Even adults found their strength fading. And in winter, when warmth and energy mattered most, weakness was dangerous. It made illnesses harder to fight, chores harder to do, and spirits harder to lift. Hunger wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Famine and death in the worst years. Famine struck. Crops failed from bad weather. Disease swept through livestock, or war disrupted farming. Suddenly, whole villages faced starvation. Records from medieval Europe tell of terrible famines where thousands died. In some regions, desperate people even ate bark, roots, or grass just to quiet their stomachs. These were extreme cases, but they left deep scars in memory. The fear of famine wasn't abstract. Everyone knew someone who had seen or survived such times. Coping strategies. Peasants weren't helpless, though. They had strategies for stretching food. Porridge and gruel, easy to make with small amounts of grain, watered down to fill more bowls. Preserving, salting, drying, or smoking foods to last longer. Foraging, even in winter, some roots, nuts, and herbs could be found. Sharing, villages often leaned on each other. A family with extra might help those with less, knowing the favor would someday be returned. These strategies didn't erase hunger, but they could soften the blow. The role of lords and the church. Sometimes, peasants received help from above literally and socially. Lords who wanted to keep their workers alive might open their grain stores in hard times, though generosity varied. Some helped, others hoarded. The church also played a part. Alms, charity, and food handouts on holy days gave the poor at least some relief. It wasn't enough to end famine, but it might mean the difference between life and death for a few families. Hunger and faith. Religion shape how peasants understood famine. Some believed it was punishment for sins. Others saw it as a test of faith. Prayers, fasts, and rituals were performed, begging God for mercy and for better harvests ahead. This faith gave people hope in the darkest days. Even when food ran out, belief in eventual deliverance carried them forward. The psychological toll. Hunger wasn't just physical, it was mental. Imagine going to bed every night with an empty stomach, waking up weaker, and knowing tomorrow might not be better. Peasants lived with this fear every winter. Even if the cupboards were full in December, by February the worrying crept in. Would the bread stretch? Would the children survive? That fear was constant, as much a part of winter as snow and smoke. Community resilience. Despite the hardship, famine also showed the strength of community. Villagers shared what they could, leaned on one another, and found ways to endure. A single family might break under the strain, but together, people found surprising resilience. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't easy, but somehow, most winters, they scraped through. Wrapping up. So, when we talk about medieval peasants surviving the cold, we can't forget the empty stomachs. The real chill of winter wasn't just in the air, it was in the fear that food might not last. They faced it with porridge, prayers, sharing, and sheer stubbornness. And while famine sometimes won, more often than not, peasants found a way to outlast the hungry gap. In the end, survival wasn't just about warmth or wool. It was about hope, the belief that spring and new harvests would come again. Comparing peasants to nobles, who had it easier in the cold, it's tempting to think that medieval nobles spent the winter wrapped in velvet robes, sipping hot wine by roaring fireplaces, while peasants froze in smoky huts. And to be fair, nobles definitely had it better. But better in the Middle Ages didn't mean cozy. Even castles could be drafty, damp, and miserably cold. So let's put it this way, peasants struggled in the cold, but nobles weren't exactly living in heated luxury either. Peasant homes versus castles. The average peasant house was tiny, built of wood, mud, or wattle and daub, with a thatched roof. Insulation was basically non-existent. The only heat came from the hearth, and most of it escaped through the roof or walls. Castles, on the other hand, were made of stone. Sounds strong, right? Well, stone is great for defense, but terrible for warmth. A thick stone wall could keep enemies out, but it also kept in the chill. Many castle rooms were as cold as caves, with fires doing little more than heating the people sitting directly in front of them. So yes, peasants lived in smoky, cramped huts, but nobles often shivered in their grand halls, wrapped in furs, wishing central heating had been invented. Clothing differences: peasants wore wool, often coarse and patched. They layered what they had, and if lucky, added some for lining. It wasn't fashionable, but it worked. Nobles, meanwhile, had finer wool, better tailoring, and access to luxurious fabrics like velvet, silk, or ermine fur. Their outfits were warmer, fancier, and sometimes so layered that nobles looked more like padded armchairs than people. Still, even silk didn't stop frostbite. If a castle was freezing, being rich didn't always keep your toes safe. Food in winter: peasants ate bread, porridge, beans, and whatever they could store. Meat was rare in winter, unless you had salted pork or a lucky hunt. Nobles had bigger stores, better meat, imported spices, and plenty of ale and wine. Winter feasts kept spirits high, with roasted boar, pies, and rich stews. But remember, if roads were blocked or harvests failed, even nobles could feel shortages. They were less likely to starve, but they weren't immune to the hungry gap. Fire and warmth in peasant huts. Everyone crowded around the hearth. It was smoky and small, but it was the center of family life. Nobles had huge fireplaces in their great halls. Servants constantly fed logs into them, trying to chase away the chill. But castles were so large and drafty that most of the heat disappeared into the high ceilings. Unless you sat close, you were still cold. In fact, nobles often carried hand warmers, small metal pots filled with hot coals, or wrapped themselves in fur-lined cloaks indoors. Some even slept with their dogs for extra warmth. Peasants did the same thing with their animals, so in the end, both groups were snuggling with livestock in one way or another. Sleeping arrangements: peasants slept on straw beds, often shared with family members. It wasn't private, but it was warm. Body heat mattered when the night was below freezing. Nobles slept in large beds with feather mattresses, heavy blankets, and thick curtains around the frame to block drafts. Their beds were more comfortable, but the need for curtains tells you something. Castles were drafty enough that even in bed, the cold was a problem. Workload differences for peasants. Winter was tough, but a little slower. Farm work paused, though there was still firewood to chop, animals to tend, and repairs to make. Hard work in the cold kept bodies warm, if not comfortable. Nobles didn't labor in the same way, but managing estates, planning hunts, and enduring endless indoor events had their own challenges. Sitting still in a cold stone hall could feel worse than being out chopping wood. At least swinging an axe warmed you up. Entertainment in winter: peasants entertained themselves with stories, songs, and small games. It was simple, but it built strong community bonds. Nobles had feasts, tournaments, weather permitting, musicians, and even jesters. Their winter entertainment was more extravagant, but it also required servants working tirelessly to keep things running. For every noble laughing at a feast, dozens of peasants were serving, cleaning, or freezing in the kitchens. Illness and medicine: both peasants and nobles faced winter sickness. The difference was that nobles had better access to physicians, but better is a relative word. Medieval doctors still relied on things like bloodletting, leeches, and odd herbal concoctions. A peasant might get a garlic poultice from the village healer. A noble might get a prescription of expensive spices from a doctor. Both remedies were hit or miss. Illness didn't care about rank. Who had it easier? Let's be honest. If you had to choose, you'd rather spend winter as a noble. More food, better clothes, softer beds. It wasn't paradise, but it beat starving in a smoky hut. But easier is relative. Nobles still shivered in castles, still caught winter fevers, and still faced the fear of famine in bad years. Wealth could soften the blow of winter, but it couldn't erase it. Wrapping up: so, who had it easier in the cold? Nobles, no question. But don't imagine them as perfectly cozy. Their castles were drafty, their fires only heated half the room, and their remedies for illness weren't much better than peasant cures. In the end, winter was the great equalizer. Whether you were a farmer huddled on straw or a lord wrapped in ermine, the cold found its way in. Enduring the season. Lessons from the past weave followed medieval peasants through their long, cold winters huddled in smoky huts, bundled in wool, praying the food would last, and telling stories by the fire. But what can we take away from all this? What do the struggles of people living hundreds of years ago teach us about survival, resilience, and maybe even ourselves? Let's take one last slow walk through those frosty nights and see what lessons remain. Winter as a test for peasants. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a test. Could your family's food stores stretch? Could your roof hold against snow? Could your body endure the cold? Every year, the season asked these questions, and not everyone passed. Yet year after year, villages endured. The lesson here is simple. Humans are tougher than we think. We've been facing harsh winters for centuries, and even with little, we find ways to survive. The power of simplicity. Peasants didn't have gadgets, heaters, or big wardrobes. What they had was simple: wool clothes, straw beds, smoky fires, and the company of their families. And yet, it worked. Sometimes survival is less about fancy tools and more about using what's available. A pile of straw might not sound cozy, but with enough layers, it kept people alive. It's a reminder that simplicity often carries surprising strength. Community above all. If one theme has echoed through every chapter, it's this: peasants survived winter together. They shared food, helped with chores, told stories, and leaned on each other when things got tough. Alone, a family might starve or freeze. Together, villages pulled through. That's a lesson that stretches beyond the Middle Ages. No matter the era, survival is a team sport. Finding joy in the hardest times. It's striking how often entertainment shows up in winter life. Songs, stories, jokes, and even gossip. These weren't just distractions. They were lifelines. Peasants knew that laughter could be as important as bread. When you can find joy even in the coldest season, you prove that hardship doesn't have the final word. Faith and hope. Religion shaped how peasants saw winter. Every snowstorm, every cough, every empty pantry had meaning in the greater story of life. Faith gave peasants a reason to keep going when everything seemed bleak. Whether or not you share their beliefs, the lesson is there: hope matters. When you believe tomorrow might be better, you're far more likely to reach it. Respect for food. Modern life often makes food feel ordinary. Grocery stores overflow, fridges hum with leftovers, and waste is easy. But for medieval peasants, every crumb mattered. A slice of bread was never just bread, it was survival. Their careful storage, stretching of stews, and sharing of supplies remind us to respect food more than we often do. For them, food wasn't convenience, it was life itself. Strength in adaptability. Peasants were masters of adapting. Not enough grain. Add water and make thing grow. Roof leaking. Patch it with whatever you can find. Winter dragging on. Tell another story, sing another song, and hold out until spring. Adaptability is survival. The peasants knew it well, and it's still true today, whether we're facing icy weather or just life's everyday challenges. The equalizer of winter. It's also worth remembering that winter humbled everyone. Nobles had more food, better clothes, and grander homes, but they still shivered in stone castles. They still caught winter fevers. They still prayed for spring. The lesson: nature doesn't play favorites. Cold finds everyone, no matter their rank. Lessons for us today: we may not live in smoky huts anymore, but modern winters bring their own challenges: loneliness, stress, and the weight of long nights. Medieval peasants can teach us a few things about facing them. Keep it simple. Warmth, food, and company go a long way. Lean on others. No one gets through winter alone. Find joy. Laughter and stories are survival tools. Hold on to hope. Spring always comes, even if it feels far away. Wrapping up. So, how did medieval peasants survive the coldest nights? With wool and straw, with porridge and prayers, with neighbors and stories. But more than anything, they survived with resilience, the quiet, stubborn strength to endure. And maybe that's the real lesson. Whether you're a medieval farmer staring at an empty grain bin, or a modern person staring at a long to-do list, Survival often comes down to the same thing. Endure today, trust that tomorrow will be better, and never underestimate the warmth of human company. The coldest nights eventually give way to dawn. They always have.